So as most of you know, this is a, just give me a second. This thing is being weird. There we go. Okay. All right. So as I mentioned, or as it's already there on the screen, this is an introductory session to Unity Asset Bundles. I'll start with just giving a brief introduction about myself and the company that I represent, so that you just have a brief idea about who is this disembodied voice talking to you about Unity Asset Bundles and what makes him particularly qualified to be talking about Unity Asset Bundles. Okay. Just to give you a brief background, I am the co-founder and CEO of a company called LONGBOW Games. We have been in existence since 2018, late 2018. And we are primarily mobile games focused. We have been working with Unity for a long time now. And our team is incredibly diverse and experienced. For example, people who are working at LONGBOW Games, they worked in companies like Zynga, Good Game Studios, Technicolor, Infosys, Oracle, Ubisoft, Reliance Games, Dhruva Interactive, EA, and all of those well-known companies. And some of the companies that we are working with include Rovio, Deca Games, Kabam, Wargaming, and those kinds of companies. As you can see, my co-founder is Shubha. She is acting as the Chief Operating Officer, and she's also a data person. For example, she has over 12 years of experience working with data, and she's worked in companies like Infosys and then moved on to working in startups, which dealt with gaming. I myself, I'm an engineer. I have over 16 years of work experience. I think now it's 17 years of work experience working in the software industry. I've done my master's from BITS Pilani. I filed a patent while I was at Oracle. And what I do is I'm fundamentally an engineer, of which 10 years I've been doing gaming and 7 years I've been outside of gaming. This is a brief background about LONGBOW and who I am, and the perspective that I will be speaking from. To go ahead, some of the things that we have extensively worked with, just to give you an example. For example, we use AWS, we use Unity, we use PlayFab, we use Node.js. We also used Fabric when it existed. Now it doesn't exist anymore. We have dealt with Google Cloud, Photon, HelpShift, and also Hockey App when it existed. Now it's App Center. So clearly 2 examples of me having to update that matrix. On the flip side, what has the team worked on? We've worked on games like Draw Something, Elvenar, Real Steel, Far Cry 3, Castleville, Halo 5, Draw Something 2, Sea of Thieves, something that doesn't exist here. So the talent in our company has worked on all of these games in some capacity or the other, right? So that's the background that we represent. So next, I will be jumping directly into this asset bundle topic itself. Right? So okay, cool. Unity gives us asset bundles. Unity is providing this particular feature, asset bundles. Wow, okay, that's a buzzword. Everybody needs to be able to deal with it. But what is this exactly? What is asset bundles, right? So if we get into it, if we exactly start exploring what this is, we start with the what. What are asset bundles, right? So an asset bundle is actually in-game content that is stored separately from the main game or application, right? And it can be loaded meaning downloaded from an external source for mobile games or online apps, or loaded locally from disk for example, let's say it is a AAA game running on Unity on your machine. You can store assets separately as asset bundles locally instead of having to download it from somewhere and load it locally, right? The why. So, all right, asset bundles are great. You can load them dynamically. You can keep the game content separate from the game code itself and load it and deal with it. Beautiful. But why would you want to do this craziness? Why would you want to do that madness? Is the question, right? So the most important thing about asset bundles is they allow developers to ship and change game content even after the game has reached the end user, right? Without the end user having to reinstall the whole game. For example, just to give you an example, if you see War Robots, which the image which I've put up on the left side, right? And if you can see the white image there and the yellow highlight that I've put up there, just to kind of clarify, I am talking about this part, right? And I'm saying, okay, 14th April, they updated. Awesome. So 14th April, they updated, and the size of the game is 909 MB, which is almost a gigabyte, right? So today's day and age, 1 gigabyte, not a big deal because there are so many, even providers like Geo, Airtel, blah, whoever, they allow you to download 1 gigabyte. So what's the big deal, right? And we'll get into that a bit. But for example, even a well-known game like War Robots, which is released on 14th April 2021, when using asset bundles is the rage, I really had to look for a game which is this big in size because all the games that I do remember from back in the day, be it G Arena, of course, PUBG not available, and then Call of Duty Modern Warfare, all of these mobile games used to be 1 GB plus download sizes. Now they've cut all of them down and they're using asset bundles for all of them. But this one game, luckily, thankfully, God bless them, for the purpose of this session, they have not used asset bundles, or at least they've kept their download size big, and they become the perfect scapegoat for this session. 1 GB download size, brilliant. So what's the problem with having a 1 gigabyte download size or something close to it? The thing that happens is, so the download size is not a one-time thing, right? The download size is something that needs to be factored with every update that you make of the game. And some games that are doing 2 updates on a monthly basis, let us say there are 2 updates and there is a there's a player who plays the game frequently. If he has to download the update of the game, every month he's spending 2 gigabytes downloading this game every month. And what we need to remember is the size of the game keeps growing as the game keeps growing older. So let us say the game was released in 2020 and it was 800 megabytes. 2022, I guarantee you, if asset bundles or all of those things have not been used, in fact, even if asset bundles are used, I'll come to that shortly. The net size of the game will not be 800 MB 2 years down the line if the game is doing well. It will be well over double the size, almost 1.5 GB. And that is because content is constantly added into the game. The game grows bigger and bigger as the game grows older and older, right? So what particularly is the problem here? So this means every time, even if I make a small change to the game, potentially, let us say, even if I change a background in the loading screen, which is actually just 1 MB, and I do a release, which is the whole game, the player actually has to download a whole 909 MB every time without fail. And so what happens is, without asset bundles, I am forcing the player to re-download the whole game for every update. And if I am doing 2 updates every month, in a year, you are easily looking at the player having downloaded over 25 GB for your game, or re-downloading the game, let us say 24 times. And if each download is a good 1 gigabyte, they've roughly downloaded 24 gigabytes through the whole year. And this could be for as little as actual content change being about 100 or 200 MB. And then if you see that, the larger the game grows, after a point of time, the player will potentially simply say, hey, look, it doesn't make sense for me to download 1 gigabyte every time. And the download size of the game itself sometimes causes players. And this is an actual thing that we have noticed. So it is very important to control the size of the games, the download sizes, And also with asset bundles, you will subsequently see that you can even manage the size, install size of the game on the disk. And we will get to that. So this establishes why asset bundles actually something you would want to use in your game, right? And that is mainly to reduce your download sizes and to have more fine-grained control over which asset you're actually forcing your player to download. Okay. All right, let's move on to the next slide as soon as this thing allows me to do it. Okay. Hang on 1 second, please. All right. Right. Just let me figure out how to trigger the annotations. 1 second. There we go. All right. So here, asset bundles. How should you potentially organize your asset bundle? Right? How should you make something an asset bundle? Right. So there are different ways in which you can organize your asset bundles, right? And assign. You can organize your assets and assign them to asset bundles. But remember to always discuss the organization structure with your team and use what works best for everyone. Because each game, and we'll get into the do's and don'ts, and we'll get into further details about these things. The way you organize your assets for a particular game completely depends on the game. The way you do it for one game will not work for every other game. And that's for a fact. For example, the way I would organize something for an infinite runner will not be the same way I organize something for an RPG. Or potentially the way I would organize something for a multiplayer game and stuff like that. So it's all different. There's no one size fits all. Let's just go through a high level view of do's and don'ts and see what are some best practices that at least we at Longbow follow, or at least what I have followed for over 7 years now. So keep all your assets under a single folder, right? Do not scatter your assets across the whole project. You don't want to be constantly using Unity's project search feature to potentially keep searching for assets and, oh, where is this asset? Where is that asset? Because the problem that happens is you will never always remember all the assets that you have used. But if you have kept your assets in one folder, the moment you go to that folder, you will intuitively know all the assets that you've used. So it's always better to keep them under one single folder and not scatter them across the whole project. And separate your art assets on a per asset basis. And what do I mean by that? For example, in one of our games, if we have fountain, if you can see, we have example of 3 fountains there. There's a small fountain 1, 2, and 3. So what we have done is fountains is an asset bundle. And then inside that, all the materials that the fountain uses, all the meshes that the fountains use, and all the prefabs that we have created for these fountains along with the textures, we structure them this way, as in the image here on your right-hand side. And then we assign the fountains folder, the whole folder, to an asset bundle. So when you do this, when you structure something like this on a per asset basis, yes, if you change one fountain, you will download the whole fountain's asset bundle, but still this asset bundle will be literally under 1 MB. And that's a small price to pay where you change one fountain and then you cause the whole asset bundle to be re-downloaded, versus you changed a small fountain and you cause the whole game to be re-downloaded. So this, in our case, this was an acceptable thing that we were willing to deal with, where we said, all right, this asset bundle is going to be, I don't know, 700 KB. If I change one fountain, if I not need the player to download all the fountains, okay, I can live with it. So this was a call we took. So we put all fountains in one asset bundle, and then we put all carpets in another asset bundle and that kind of stuff. And try to keep things as granular as possible, right? For example, the degree of granularity entirely depends on the project and what it needs. And like I was saying, there's no one size fits all approach. For example, we have done fountains like this, as you can see in the image, where we said, okay, 750 KB of downloads is fine. Whereas if you do an RPG, you might want to structure the asset bundle on a per character basis or on a per level up basis. For example, we had done a game previously while I was at Good Game Studios in Germany. We had made a game which was a XCOM clone kind of a thing, but the difference was you leveled up each and every unit of yours. And when you leveled up units, what would happen is additional features would get added on to make a visual difference. Additional features would get added on top of the unit. So what we did was we made each unit and all of its upgrade pieces one single asset bundle. So each unit, for example, we had 3 different kinds of tanks, we had 2 different kinds of flying units and all of that. And we made each one of them asset bundles, separate asset bundles, and all their upgrade steps. They had some 10 odd upgrade steps and everything. So then each asset bundle came to a particular, I think 1.5 MB size for each unit. But that organization was necessary for us so that if we made a change to one unit, if we made a change to a unit, we would also have to make a change to all its upgrade paths and elements. So eventually we would have to force the player to download all the upgrades and everything. And anyway, we would make changes on a per unit basis. So it made sense to have each unit as a particular asset bundle. So that's the way we organize it. And clearly you can see that organization is different from the way we organized fountains in another game of ours. So yeah, it completely depends on your project and it completely depends on what your needs are. Okay. And always remember, asset bundles can use assets from other asset bundles as well. Okay. So when you're building asset bundles, Unity will mark them as being dependent on each other. So it is good to put all common asset bundles into one single bundle and create a dependency. And why is that good? Because if there is a dependency, you can force Unity to load a particular asset bundle and then subsequently load any other dependencies which are there. It's like if any of you have installed software on Linux, when you're installing one thing, if it has dependencies on other libraries, Linux will track it down and install all the dependencies. Similarly, if you want to load one asset bundle, let us say I wanted to load Small Fountain, but Small Fountain had a dependency on a particular material, which is there in a Commons asset bundle, which I have created. So then not only will the Fountains asset bundle get loaded, but the Commons will get loaded as well if it has not been loaded. So that's a good way to do things, where what will happen is if there are multiple things depending on one common asset bundle, that one thing gets loaded, memory size is fixed, and then you can load and unload the other dependent asset bundles. And that way your memory organization of your game will be very efficient and you won't get booted out of memory. Okay. Don'ts. Of course, if you want your rights, you have your duties. Fundamental rights means fundamental duties. So if you're going to say do's, then there are also going to be don'ts. Don't mix asset bundles and code in the same folder. Keep them separate. If you mix your asset bundles and your code, for example, let us say there was fountains here. I added another folder called code because I said, okay, everything that is dealing with fountains, I want it to be in one place. And then the root folder fountains, I assigned it to asset bundles. And then I built it. My code will also get shipped along with this asset bundle as raw text asset. You don't want that. That's not a good thing. So what you do want to do is keep your code separate from asset bundles. And yes, I have seen people do these things in real world projects. That's the reason I made a list. I put that down as a list. And also don't make one single asset bundle with all your assets in it, right? It again defeats the purpose. The point of asset bundles is granular control so that you don't have to download one single fat monolithic thing. So you do want to split your asset bundles across multiple assets and not make it one single fact. Additionally, don't create asset bundles and then pick the asset from the bundle and dump it in the scene. Unless your scenes are also asset bundles, in which case, if your scene is in an asset bundle and your other asset is in a bundle, a dependency will be marked between the two, and that's fine. But let us say if I created asset fountains asset bundle and I dragged and dropped the small fountain default fountain item onto a scene, it defeats the purpose because. And if I built the scene and put it in the build in the game, all this default fountain asset and any materials and textures that it depends on, they will also be embedded into it. And that defeats the whole purpose of making asset bundles, right? So you don't want to embed assets into the scene, which you've put in an asset bundle unless you're very clear what you're doing. Okay. And avoid duplicating assets across asset bundles. There's no sense in duplicating assets. Create common assets and cause a dependency between asset bundles, right? That's what you want to be doing, and you don't want to be duplicating things. Yeah. Moving on to the next slide. Now, just to give you an overall view in terms of how asset bundles actually work. I won't get into the code. That's an entirely subjective thing, and that's a completely different thing. What I am going to do here is give you a block diagram, give you an overview of how things work. So let us say you have your assets in a Git repository. It could be Git, Perforce, SVN. Depending on how you want to torture yourself, you can choose which asset repository you want to use. In increasing orders of torture, there is Git, there is Perforce, and then there is SVN. If you really want to torture yourself, yes. But yeah, or even BCS, which was from Microsoft. Yeah, it's all fun. So then you would have an asset bundle build system, which would be C# code and Jenkins jobs or something like that. We had something called an asset bundle copy config. That's something we had where we were choosing where asset bundles get copied after they get built. So the assets are pulled by the asset bundle system from the Git repository, and then you build them for a given platform. Okay? So asset bundles are platform dependent. You either build them for iOS or Android, simply because you use different compression settings for your textures for iOS and Android. For example, most often you would use EC2 4-bit compression, if I remember it correctly. On Android and on iOS, you have various formats. You have a PVRTC format, you have an ASTSC format, depending on which device you're targeting. So those two formats are different. And when you build an asset bundle, the image gets bundled as that format and goes into the asset bundle. So you have to create separate builds of asset bundles for each platform. So once you're done, depending on what your asset bundle copy config is, it either goes into the streaming assets of the app, or it goes into Amazon S3 or any CDN for that matter, which you want. And then once it is gone in Amazon S3 or streaming assets, we build the game. Once the game has been built, once the asset bundle system, and then the asset bundle system or the asset bundle system code in the game, once the game is launched, it loads up and it says, okay, what do I need to pick up from the streaming assets? And then it loads them from there. And then it says, oh, wait, I'm supposed to have 10 asset bundles, but there are only 3 in the streaming assets. Where are the rest? And then there is some config which says, hey, by the way, the rest are there on Amazon S3. You need to pick these up as well. And so the system goes to Amazon S3 and then it downloads all of them and then it caches them locally on Unity. Unity, there is a Unity asset bundle cache. So it caches it on the asset bundle cache. I think the cache size is configurable. You can choose how much size you want to allocate to the asset bundle, to the asset bundle cache. And then if your asset bundles exceed that size, they will be dropped from the cache. So yeah, you can control all of these things in the asset bundle system, and then it merges and manages the loading of the asset bundles unloading of the asset bundles, moving from scene to scene. The asset bundle system has an idea of which asset is there in which bundle. So all I need to do is request the asset bundle system for an asset. And if that asset bundle has not been loaded, it will load the asset bundle, load its dependencies, and return an instance of that game object to me, or the requesting code in this case. And that's the way the whole thing is organized. So yeah, you pick your assets, you build for a platform, you upload it to Amazon S3, or you dump it in streaming assets, and then the game gets built, and whatever is there in streaming assets gets shipped onto the player's device, and your asset bundle system then decides how it needs to deal with the asset bundle system. And here in this case, when I say asset bundle system, it is a custom system that we have built at Longbow. This is not something that ships by default or something like that. But yeah, overall, this is the way you need to deal with asset bundles. I won't get into the code snippets and all of those things because you can very easily look up these things on the internet. Back in the day when I was doing engineering, yes, we didn't have internet in the dorm. So anybody giving a presentation would have to kind of tell us, hey, look, you need to go write this code or look at this man page. But thankfully, due to advancing technology, I don't need to do that low-level stuff anymore. Moving on to the next slide, some miscellaneous items about asset bundles, right? Anything that I might have missed, not have covered, anything that I overlooked. So I've just put them all in here. So asset bundles need to be built for each platform separately, right? They're not platform independent, like I mentioned. Build them for iOS, build them for Android, manage them separately, because the image compression formats that you use for iOS and Android are different. Of course, you can include scenes, scriptable objects, and a few other asset types in asset bundles. Like I was saying, even text will go into asset bundles if you're not careful about it and you bundle it that way. Literally, for a fact, one of the projects I was working on before I came on there as a lead and fixed those issues, along with shipping the game, these guys were also bundling their source code and shipping it in the APK. And they did not know that they were doing that because they had assigned everything to asset bundles. I personally do not prefer assigning individual assets to asset bundles. I prefer assigning entire folders. But some people want to be able to assign individual asset bundles, individual assets to asset bundles. That's their choice of doing things like that. But I personally feel it just becomes extremely cumbersome to deal with a system like that. But yeah, there are people who do it that way as well. If you're not careful, like I was saying, your source code can get bundled as text assets in your asset bundles. And asset bundles can be shipped with your build by putting them in streaming assets folder, or they can be uploaded to a server, Amazon S3, a CDN, Akamai, Amazon's own CDN, whatever, and later on downloaded by your application, right? Remember that asset bundles will take up space on the mobile device after they're downloaded and unpacked. So what you want to be doing is smartly structure your asset bundles in such a way that, for example, let us say the player is between level 1 and level 10. There are only XYZ assets that you need the player to download. Let us say he moves beyond level 10 and then he's level 11. So level 10 to level 20 is another type of different set of assets that he uses. He will not be using any items from under level 10, for example. So depending on how you've done your game design, depending on how you've structured things, you can even structure your asset bundles in this way, where they are broken down based on player levels. RPGs sometimes do that. So then basically what happens is they're saying, hey, look, if my player has hit level 15, he is definitely not going to be using any item level 10 and lesser. So I'm going to delete those asset bundles from the device. The engineer goes ahead and does that. And that's how they manage the asset bundle space locally on device. So there are many, many strategies that you can use to manage how much space asset bundles will take up locally on device. Remember that the harsh reality of things is When you run out of space, even you as individuals, when you run out of space on your device, the first thing that will be uninstalled are games. So the lesser space that they take on your device, the greater are the chances that your games will not be uninstalled on lower end devices. Higher end devices, not such a big problem, but on lower end devices, let us say it's a 32 GB. Your mom and dad or your uncles or somebody who's older, grandparents or somebody, they're using devices, they're playing a small game. And then suddenly they say, beta, space nahi hai device pe, kya kare? Then the first thing you or them will do is they'll look at the list of apps and they'll say, अच्छा ये games है मैं बाद में जब मुझे when I don't need some other app अभी मैं ये game को हटा देता हूँ then I'll make space for some other app from some like when I'm not using some other app I'll put this game back. So games are the first casualty of space crunches on devices. Always remember this. So the lesser space your game takes, the lower down the list it will be, and the greater the chances that some other app takes the hit. And of course, then the last point being there are a lot of changes that you can make to your game through asset bundle and change player experience without having to ship a new release. For example, let us say you put config files in your asset bundle and then you make a few changes to a config file. And then you'll release that config file. Your game will download the asset bundle, read the config file, and the player restarts the game. And then lo and behold, your game will function in a different way. Unless the config does not require new assets or logic to be put in the game, your game will function differently. So that way you can control how the game behaves in runtime without having to ship a release, but by just making changes in config. So this is a very powerful thing to remember that asset bundles allow you to. Of course, there are more powerful techniques that many people use, but this is a poor man's way of being able to do this without having to do a release. And it's worth having this trick up your sleeve. The last thing that I will address here is something called addressables. So addressables are slightly different from asset bundles in the sense that the way the system fundamentally is supposed to work is very different. It's supposed to solve a lot of the problems that exist with asset bundles, but it functions differently, right? Back in the day when I evaluated addressables, there were a bunch of problems with addressables. So I never got into using addressables in my games. But it may very well be a reality that down the line, maybe 1 or 2 years down the line, you may just not be able to avoid it. Or it just doesn't make sense to avoid it anymore because of the features that potentially exist in addressable. Okay. So from that perspective, just to give you a very high overview of what addressables are, right? So addressables are different from asset bundles. Different how? We'll get to that in a bit. So addressables are good for using on a completely new project and not so much for an existing project which is already using asset bundles. The reason for this is because when the build process of addressables is different from the build process of asset bundles. In asset bundles, you don't need a catalog, you don't need a provider, and you don't need to tag contents and create that whole bucket of artifacts and stuff like that with asset bundles. But with your addressable system, you need to do that. And you also need to change the way you deal with assets when you switch over to an addressable system. So if you have an existing game which has a solid asset bundles implementation, probably doesn't make sense to use the addressable system. But if you're doing a new game completely, worth exploring if addressables solves a bunch of your problems. Because you need to configure your assets in a different way. You need to structure them in a different way if they are to work well with addressables. So that's the reason I'm saying worth taking a look at if it is something that works well for you. And addressables is meant like released as a package or a library meant to make it easier to work with and load assets dynamically in the game, right? Thing to remember is asset bundles and addressables are meant to force you to dynamically load and unload assets rather than embed them in your scenes. Okay, That's the important thing to remember about addressables and asset bundles. And the same functionality as addressables can be achieved with asset bundles and custom code, which is exactly what we are doing at Longbow. And like the point says, it's being done by many other developers already. So addressables was introduced by Unity to provide an alternative to smaller developers having to create their own system to deal with loading assets, right? For example, Longbow is a big company. There are about 8, 10 engineers. Okay, I can assign one person to work on an asset bundle loading system. But let's say there's a smaller indie dev. There are just one people, one engineer, one game designer, one artist. One engineer having to sit down for a month to write an asset bundle loading system, the game designer and artists are going to get pretty pissed with him and say, dude, what have you been doing for a month? And he's going to be like writing the asset bundle loading system. And then the guy goes, why? And he says, because I want to dynamically load assets and do all of these things. And the guy is going to say, what difference is it going to make? Just dump the assets in the game, get the game going. How the asset is loaded doesn't make a difference. So they won't understand the importance, or they may not be able to understand the importance of dynamically loading assets. But somebody who's coming from an engineering perspective will. So in that situation, using a ready addressable system makes sense, where he doesn't have to spend 1 month writing a asset bundle loading system, but in 1 or 2 days can go through the documentation and get there much faster. And they provide the whole thing about loading it to a CDN and then building your assets and blah and everything, right? And the mechanism for dynamically loading, unloading, downloading, uh, everything is taken care of by addressable system. There is even a debugger available where the addressable system shows the memory pressure that is there for your app and stuff like that. So yeah, overall, uh, this is a very, very high level overview of your asset bundle systems, addressables, and how asset bundles are used. What is their use in real world scenario where there are game developers developing games on Unity and stuff like that. So I pretty much have come to the end of my presentation. I just want to open up the floor to questions and interaction, comments. Uh, and yeah, basically, Priyanka, I hand it over back to you. Thank you. Hello.
But sir, I'm curious. You said you have been working on a XCOM clone-like game. What was the name?
So this game has already been shut down over
Ah,
2 years ago. It was called Alpha Assault. It's from Good Game Studios. I think there are a couple of videos floating around on YouTube for the game. But yeah, it was called Alpha Assault. The game got shut down because the metrics were not that great.
okay, so unfortunate.
That's the way it goes in the gaming industry, anyways. So it's okay. It's all part of the parcel. Any other questions? Anything that you want me to go over again? I was too fast. I was not clear enough. You want me to cover anything in more depth? You have a question completely unrelated to asset bundles as well. I'll do my best to answer.
I think, Mr. Amog, you made it everything a justice. It was very clear. This is Ajay here.
All right, Ajay. Hey.
Yeah, it was very clear. I think so. I think now they would have got a clear picture on the development aspects, how to develop and how to package the application in a better way. I think you made it up. I think it's very crystal clear.
Awesome. Sounds good.
Yeah. Priyanka, is this note? I think the students don't have any questions. I think you can wind up the session.
Yeah. Any other questions that they want? Please don't think that, oh, what will people think if I ask this question? It may sound cliched when I say that there is actually no such thing as a dumb question. It's not genuinely not cliched. So do not hesitate to ask any question that comes to mind.
Drop that question if you cannot unmute. Just drop that question in the chat also. I think that would be great. So Amok can see and reply.
Yep, can do.
So guys, drop your questions in the chat also. Prabhakar sir, Pradeep sir, if you have any questions, or Prashant, you guys have any questions, just please drop it up.
Sir, I have a question about the game developing usually was. In many games, in many RPG games, generally in RPG games, they have whenever you have your characters and you make him evolve, you make him get some new equipment, they prefer to keep the same and only appearance of the characters. But there are really rare games that change the appearance of the character regarding his equipment. So I was thinking, I think it's that, but I was thinking, is it because the graphic will need a lot more work to achieve this kind of result? Or is there any reason for them to avoid this in particular?
So I'll just repeat your question, and please let me know if I've got it correctly. Basically, you're asking me that in RPG games, some games, when the character evolves, they improve the equipment, but some other games do not, and why those games don't do that, correct?
Yes, sir. Why they don't change the appearance of the equipment?
Correct. So there is a minor cost associated with upgrading equipment, but it is not such a big thing that we need to worry about it and not upgrade the equipment. There are two things here. Actually, there are many factors that come into play. The first thing let's start with why people change the appearance of equipment, right? And that's a simpler one to answer, which is something as simple as, hey, they change the appearance of the equipment so that people feel that an upgrade has happened. You've achieved something in the game, feeling of achievement, all the good stuff. All right, great. Why do sometimes people not change the appearance of the equipment? It could simply be that they forgot to do it. It sounds like a very silly answer, but trust me, sometimes they just overlook the fact that, oh, we had to change the appearance of this equipment. They forget about it. And the game designer goes ahead and rebalances the equipment, and they've forgotten to upgrade the visual appearance of the equipment. Sometimes it could even be a bug that the actual asset has been shipped in the game, but it's not getting loaded. In other situations, it could very simply be that the asset was not completed in time to be shipped, so that when the new asset was supposed to be used there, they did not have a new asset, so they simply chose to reuse an old one. Sometimes it could very simply be that they don't have the budget or the resources or the manpower to actually create a new asset. There are so many reasons why something like this could have happened, and it completely depends on the team and what was the circumstances surrounding that situation, why they did not upgrade that, or why they did not make it appear as a separate art asset. So yeah, I hope this kind of gives you some idea about why such things might happen.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay, awesome.
Among you just mentioned like it may be silly, but it's okay. But asking this question, like you
Yes.
said, they will forget updating that. But if we see that if many companies, if it may be small studio or a bigger studio, they would have a tracking concept where they have to keep on updating in every update on certain things. Like it may be on like as just now the question was on weapons, or it may be on any kind of an assets. They would have a track on that, right? So that they will make sure it is updating. But is there a chance that they tend to forget? I'm not talking about the indie developers. I'm talking about the company who's representing them as a studio.
Oh, absolutely. Even companies as big as Zynga, such issues have happened. Uh, I mean, if you look at even bigger games, right? For example,
Mm.
recently all the mess that surrounded Cyberpunk 2077, right? Uh, for example, many players noticed issues further down the line where assets were simply reused, or if you or because they didn't have the time to work on a particular asset, they reuse the asset. But coming down to do they really forget? Uh, yes, sometimes they do really forget. For example, let us say it's a matter of of pressing a button so that asset bundles are built and uploaded to a CDN. It could very well be that even though it exists in the check sheets, and even though the producer went to the engineer and said, "Hey, dude, you need to press that button," the engineer sometimes forgets. And it happens to all of us. You might wonder, in what situation could these guys even forget? For example, it could be something as simple as, let's say, especially because we have students here, you're all going to write exams. Uh, in the good old days when your exams actually happened in an examination hall, just before going to the exam, you are in that last minute rush getting ready, right? A release feels exactly like that. Last minute rush to achieve a particular goal, to be where you need to be, going through your checklist and saying, oh, did I pick up my pen? Did I pick up my hall ticket? Oh, have I picked up my hanky? Oh, have I picked up that bottle of water? And then, oh, have I picked up that lucky charm which I need for this tough subject so that I do not fail in it? Have I prayed to all of my gods to make sure that I'm safe? And then when you go to that exam hall, in the checklist of all of these things, I am 100% sure you will have forgotten something. And then when you go there, you're like, oh, shucks, I forgot this. So it happens to the best of us, no matter how you guys would have written 1,000 exams by the time you've gotten here. But invariably, sometimes under stress, under pressure, that does happen to all of us, every one of us. It will continue to happen to you in your life. So don't try to be very compulsive about it and say, oh, in the future, I'll never forget. It happens. And yes, to answer your question, Vijay, it definitely happens. Even if you have a checklist, even if you have everything, even if you have four pairs of eyes looking at something, sometimes things do get missed.
Even in updates, also you're saying this, right?
Even in updates, even in development,
Okay.
reviews, it's just a human thing.
Okay.
It's still, as of today, it's still human beings making games. Once AI start doing it, maybe they won't miss it.
Of course, AI will not come into it because it's human. It's a thinking. That's
But
where I think gaming industry and the media industry is the one place I think AI cannot take over much things because the thinking aspects are involved.
That's where maybe Google and Facebook will say, hang on, hold my beer for a second. Uh, don't be too sure.
but
Okay.
even here are made by humans, so
Sorry, what?
even EA are made by humans, so I'm pretty sure there will be some mistakes there.
Hopefully.
That's really great.
Yeah.
I think let's wind up the session. I think everything going right,
Right.
and it was a lot of things was clear, but I had this question in my mind because it's like you said, like there are a lot of QA testers are there. After crossing so many channels, it goes up. Yes, there is a say that you do mistakes.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Uh, they're- so if it is just one or two or three people, it's like this, right? The more the links in the chain, the more the chances that a particular link will fail. It is not saying it from a negative perspective, because on different parts of the whole link and chain, there is different amounts of load at different points of time. So it's just a human thing, dude. It's just a human thing.
Okay, great. Hey, thanks for your session, Mr. Amok. It was really good.
No worries. Thank you
It
very
was
much.
really thank you all.
And just a word for your students, please
Yes,
do not
please.
hesitate to ask questions.
Mhm.
When you're interacting with people from the industry, this is one of the best ways in which uh, you can gain an understanding of what to expect when you guys get into the industry, and not be wondering, oh, what should I expect when I get there? So make the best use of such situations. Yeah, that's it from my side, guys.
I accept Mr. Amok, and it was a nice day to everyone. I think from now onwards, at least the students will ask students questions from the industry experts.
Awesome. Sounds good. All right, guys. See you around. All the best. All the best for your future. Okay.
Many thanks, Serge.
No worries.